And just to remind everybody that there is a recording that's being made of this presentation. So those of your colleagues who are unable to join us today will still have access to the conversation. Given that people have different bandwidths all over the world, I would request, and also for clarity, I would request that you keep yourself muted, and that after we've had this initial introduction, that you turn off your videos. So hopefully that will keep things a little bit more stable. I'm currently sitting here in the UK, and I've just had the message, your internet is unstable. So please help me by turning your video off shortly. Thank you. So welcome one and all. I'd like to kick off this very exciting introduction to the stakeholders ecosystem with an old English saying and proverb, which goes, a trouble shared is a trouble halved. I'm sure there are interpretations of that in many other cultures. And in today's webinar, the relevance of that saying is that Jasmine and Andrew, along with colleagues from the iACT team, will be exploring with us the whole strategic concept of the stakeholders ecosystem. And we'll be exploring an understanding of that ecosystem and how an understanding of your ecosystem can both halve your troubles and contribute to building a stronger solutions. So with that very brief handover to Jasmine and Andrew, can I ask you all to wave a greeting and now switch off your videos and sit back, relax and enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Penny. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining the session. We've had a huge sign up today, and I'm sure that just says something about being back together in this webinar series, but maybe it also just says something about this topic of stakeholders and how important that is to the work of so many organizations around the world. I think one of the characteristics of working in the social sector, working on humanitarian development challenges is that there are lots of stakeholders, and understanding those stakeholders, working with them, pulling people together, forming groups, communities, working out how to get stakeholders benefiting from each other's work is just so fundamental to what we do and how we work. So I'm gonna do a bit of scene setting at the beginning, based on some work where, as Penny was just saying, Jasmine and I have had the huge pleasure of working together and with so many others as well. We're going to set the scene, and we're then going to hand over for a case study to look a little more in depth at a real life example of the theme we want to introduce. And then to make sure that this isn't just a webinar where you sit and listen, but actually one where you really participate and share the huge amount of experience that sits in this virtual room, we're going to break out into some discussion groups and give you an opportunity to talk about some of the ideas that we've been thinking of and how it relates to your work, and share some of that experience around the group. So that's the structure of the webinar this afternoon. Let me just tell you a bit of a story about how we got to this point. And it started back in March 2020. And I've used the initials BC after that date of March 2020, which of course stands for before COVID. Literally, we managed to get a workshop in Nairobi, Kenya, just at the point at which COVID was creeping around the planet. But I don't think any of us really understood the implications of what was to follow. And during that workshop, lots of teams, it was a transition to scale workshop, and lots of the teams were talking about the challenges and experience related to working with stakeholders. So as we often do at transition to scale workshops, afterwards we captured all those post-its and notes and materials that people had produced and sat there and did a huge sort of synthesis exercise to try and understand some of the common themes and ideas that were coming out. And that caused us to put together one of the thematic briefs that's available on the Saving Brains website at the moment. And we'll put that link into the chat in a moment so you can get there and see the whole thematic brief if you haven't. It doesn't take long to read. It's about a 20-minute read, but what it does is identify 5 different perspectives on stakeholder relationships, which we observed were really coming from the teams at that workshop, and different perspectives that I think really have the ability to change the way that organizations are thinking about and engaging with stakeholders. Perspectives that take us a long way beyond some of the sort of thinking that we often just transfer from the business world of, say, thinking about something like a value chain where, you know, it's one stakeholder communicates with another one, almost as a linear line, and thinking about this much more as a stakeholder ecosystem. And that concept of a ecosystem was quite a big choice in the way we framed the thematic brief itself. We talked about ecosystems of stakeholders because it really came across to us how complicated and complex are the networks of stakeholders involved in all of our work. This isn't about one stakeholder talking to one other stakeholder. It's about whole networks interacting, often without us even in the picture. So understanding this as an ecosystem was quite a useful reference. And from that, we pulled out 5 different perspectives that we saw frequently being referred to. The perspective 1, I'm just going to cover these very, very quickly, but perspective 1 being the idea that, particularly in our sectors, a really deep understanding of stakeholders is taken for granted. And actually what we saw among most of the teams in Kenya was a real ability to deeply empathize with the perspectives of other stakeholders, to literally see the world through the eyes of others. So that was critical. Second, we observed that most of the organizations were not putting themselves at the center of the stakeholder system and their understanding of it. They were realizing that actually there were many others in there who possibly were even more central than they were. Third is we titled this "We're all in it for the kids," but maybe not. A recognition that sometimes motivations, what is in it? What is in it for me? What do I actually get out of this system? Sometimes aren't quite obvious and need to be investigated. And if what I get out of it isn't obvious, perhaps what I put into it isn't obvious either. So the idea of what I get and what I give into a stakeholder system is really important to understand if you're going to make that work. We also investigated the idea of win-win-win, the idea that for a stakeholder system to work, it's important that multiple players are getting benefits out of it, that if you like, the wins go right the way around the whole system, not just bilateral wins like a buying and selling something, but wins that really incentivize the whole system to work together. So those 4 perspectives are really important, and we're going to use other workshops to go into them. But today we particularly wanted to focus on the 5th workshop, the 5th perspective here of valuing an undervalued stakeholder, and that's where we're going to focus the call today, and I'm going to explain a bit more about it. So what we decided to do, having identified these 5 perspectives from the work of teams in Nairobi, was we actually created a workshop. We thought, could we actually work with teams to apply these 5 perspectives and really create a much more sophisticated and detailed map of an organization's work, and then use these 5 perspectives to really look for new strategic opportunities to support scaling, to support quality, to support all of the things that you're ultimately aiming to achieve. And so that's what we did. We developed a new workshop, and in that workshop, one of the perspectives we looked at was this idea of valuing an undervalued stakeholder. So let me just talk about that just very briefly as a concept, and what does it mean. And we first spotted this because in Kenya, we used a great case study that I think many of you on this call have seen being used at one or more of the Saving Brains convenings. We looked at the Community Empowerment Lab and the great example of kangaroo mother care that they've developed now over many years. And particularly particularly at that Kenya meeting, Arti from Community Empowerment Lab talked about this model and their work. And one of the things we noticed about that was that obviously in the kangaroo mother care, as the name suggests, the real focus, the purpose is focused on the mother and the baby. Kangaroo mother care is a way of nurturing and looking after the youngest of children soon after birth. And the focus really is the mother and the baby doing that. But one of the interesting things about Arti's story is actually the way this other stakeholder comes into the picture, the stakeholder called the KMC nurse. And it's the nurse working with the mother in those hours after birth that really makes the difference as to what happens. And when Community Empowerment Lab explored that, what they discovered about the nurse was that the relationship with the mother was really critical, that the nurse needed to be showing respect to the mother to create an environment in which the mother could really engage in that skin-to-skin contact and so on. That's so important. But actually what they were often finding was nurses that were too hurried, they were underpaid, they were undertrained and supported. Frankly, the nurses weren't expected as a player in the whole system. And what Community Empowerment Lab asked themselves was, how's a nurse supposed to show respect and create an environment for the mother if actually the nurse herself isn't respected, hasn't experienced respect in the first place? And this was this kind of dawning moment of a socially appreciated, undervalued stakeholder that was really important to make this system work. What Community Empowerment Lab went on, and I'll save the story for another time for those who haven't seen it, what they really worked out how to bring the nurse as a really central and important player in the system. And critical to that was showing the nurse respect for the importance of her or his role in the whole system as well. But today, rather than looking at Community Empowerment Lab, we want to bring in another case, and it's a case from one of the organizations that worked with us on the development of this first workshop around stakeholders. Wonderful organization called iACT, and a program they run called Little Ripples. Little Ripples is active in Chad, Tanzania, Cameroon and Greece. And today on the call, a pleasure to introduce Katie J. Scott, who's Executive Director of iACT, and Amy Gilmore, who's the Sports Program Manager. And I'm going to hand the floor over to the two of you just to, first of all, give us an introduction to your work and what you do, but then also maybe just to talk about your socially undervalued stakeholder and why that's so central to your work and what it is you do to bring that stakeholder into your work and projects and strengthen that. So with that as an introduction, over to you, Katie J.
Thank you, Andrew, and Jasmine and the Saving Brains team for having us this morning. Well, this morning here in Los Angeles, very early. iACT is the name of our organization, and our early learning program that is community-led is called Little Ripples. And you see here, this is one of the times when they do outdoor play. And this picture, I always like to start with this picture because it just has so much joy. The little girl's face is just so present and excited to be part of her Little Ripples pond. So iACT's, I think central to our story of creating Little Ripples alongside and with refugee and displaced communities is really our origin story as an organization. We started as an advocacy organization, and part of our role within the advocacy movement for Darfur when the genocide began in 2004 was to really bring forward the voices of the displaced community. And so speed that up many years after that, when international aid organizations were beginning to leave the region, as many do because there is a cycle within international aid and development, the refugee community began asking us for support, especially for their children. And one of those things was preschool. And then one of them was a football program for older youth. So when we were called into action by the community members that we had created long-term relationships with, our first response really was, well, how do we approach it in a way where the community itself is at the center and owns it, manages it, is able to make all of the decisions. They were asking for preschool for early learning. And so we took a call out internationally and said, you know, for folks who are in early learning, teacher training, curriculum development, trauma, recovery and resilience, psychology, let's come together and think about what the best possible early learning program would be. Not for refugees, but what is the best program that we can offer to our children anywhere in the world? So for me, here in Los Angeles, what are people paying thousands of dollars for to put their kids into on a monthly basis at 3 and 4 years old? And so we came together and we really created a framework, and we didn't complete it. So we waited until we returned to the camp, laid out our ideas, began the experiential teacher training process, and had ideas for a curriculum and for a daily program. And then with the refugee community themselves, in this case, our community was the Darfur community living in Eastern Chad, we completed the program. And I think it's really important to point out that the refugee community brings with it all of the expertise that they had before they were forced to leave Darfur, Sudan, and found a new home in Eastern Chad. And all these years later, 17 years later, they're still in the same camps. And so, Angie, if you'll just go to the next slide for me. And so from our experience in co-creating Little Ripples with the Darfur refugee community in Eastern Chad, a framework really began to form. And over the years of the community leading the program, which means the day-to-day operations, we have very little teacher turnover, but if a teacher needs to leave for some reason, or they get resettled in another country, the local community themselves, the camp coordinator, the education director, and some of the peer teachers come together and train and onboard new teachers. And so through this experience, this model, the Little Ripples model, has surfaced. And then we've been able to replicate it in other countries and with and alongside other community members. So I would say we've never really looked at the refugee community as undervalued. I wouldn't use that term, but I would say that they're so central to our model, yet in humanitarian programming, they are undervalued as a whole. And for Little Ripples, they just become, I mean, we have a very small staff in the United States, and we have about 198 refugee or displaced community members in the regions that Andrew mentioned earlier, and really central to that, and a piece that we're excited to be rethinking about that surfaced during our workshop with Saving Brains is most of our monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning in the international and NGO world is to us as the organization or to donors. And so what we're trying to rethink is how do we center the refugee community in the same way we did when we created Little Ripples, in the same way that the teacher training is experiential, the curriculum is co-completed, all the day-to-day operations are in the hands of the local community. How does our M&E reflect that? I don't know the answer to that yet, because we're still working through how to shift M&E from sort of monitoring and child outcomes into something that can be more relational, where the teachers and the assessment crew who is on the ground themselves and part of the community can use the information they're taking in and iterate upon the program more quickly. So that was some of the things we're thinking about in terms of our stakeholders and our refugee community members. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Amy, and she's going to share a little bit more about the stakeholder map.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So we earlier in the spring had the great pleasure of working with Saving Brains to help create our humanitarian ecosystem map by sharing the story of iACT and Little Ripples and its development and growth over the years to really get this kind of bird's eye view of the program and kind of where iACT and Little Ripples are positioned within this broader ecosystem, which you can see here. I know it's difficult when it's zoomed out, but with central stakeholders and the circles there, and then the relationships that we have with these stakeholders and kind of the value and the impact, that they have, summarized in the lines in between. And I think when you look at a map as a whole, you can see all those different perspectives that Andrew mentioned at the beginning of his presentation. And there's so much we could talk about here. So I'll try and just pick a few key things that came out of us for this workshop. So I think as you can, see as we move towards talking about the undervalued stakeholder, the iACT isn't in the center of this map, and that really a lot of these key relationships with stakeholders are happening between and alongside and within the refugee community as you look down towards the bottom left of our map. And as Katie J said, well, because of iACT's development and growth, we don't consider refugee communities undervalued. In more traditional or top-down models of aid, refugees have been overlooked as central stakeholders and actors in humanitarian responses. And this is a way in which iACT actively seeks to shift power in the humanitarian system. And so if you look at the different stakeholders within the refugee community and their relationship with iACT, I think you can really see a lot of these reciprocal relationships that show the value of affirming and supporting the agency of refugee actors. So it's not only, iACT working directly with teachers and education directors who are employed to run Little Ripples programs, but also the relationships that stem from that and that include the broader community. So the impact on children, of course, but also with children's families and in trying to implement livelihood solutions that then go back and support the Little Ripples program. So you can really see how it's not, it's really valuing the community as a whole and all the different relationships within that, and kind of mapping this out with Saving Brains, really helped us to see and solidify all these different relationships and how interactive they are within Little Ripples and iACT's work as a whole. And I think something else that kind of led to this and tied to the other perspectives was that by mapping out this ecosystem this way, especially around iACT's relationship with refugee communities, it also obviously then tied in with a lot of the other perspectives that Andrew mentioned. And I think we often think about our relationship with refugee communities as a win, win for iACT and supporting its mission and its work, and a win for refugee communities in supporting their agency and providing the sustainable support for education. But then identifying, kind of what would traditionally be seen as undervalued stakeholders also helped us, think about a next step of those win-win-win scenarios that Andrew was mentioning, where not only is this beneficial for iACT and refugee communities, but how can this, help shape and potentially change the humanitarian ecosystem as a whole. And in that case, I think a big learning for us and something we really try and focus on is then, moving from kind of the bottom right corner of the map up towards the top right, and thinking about how then we can connect iACT's model and working with, traditionally what would be considered undervalued stakeholders to connect the learnings from Little Ripples and what we learn from refugee communities to then tie that in with other actors in the ecosystem, like global communication stakeholders or research institutes and think tanks and donors and funders, to kind of show this way in which power is shifting in the system and how that can be beneficial for not only, iACT's corner of the ecosystem, but the, humanitarian ecosystem as a whole. So as I said, I could go on a lot about all the different components of this map that we were really excited about. And that was, so helpful working alongside Saving Brains to kind of map out and really think about, where our strengths are and also where we have opportunities to work with others and create an even bigger impact. So we're, really excited about it. And if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Katie J, Amy, thanks so much. When I listen to you speak, it really comes across to me the extent to which your focus on the refugee community itself is really, first of all, just deeply, deeply embedded in your whole model. It wasn't added in afterwards. It was the basis on which it was created. But it's also a great illustration of this idea of why focusing on a socially undervalued group, in addition to your main beneficiary, because I guess many organizations would focus purely on the child here and would talk about the value of your work to the individual child, which is of course significant. But actually you've got this great sort of additional story to tell about the whole refugee community that you're influencing as a result of really having identified this second group and brought them in. I'm intrigued to know that just from reality, you know, some of the challenges you have of getting that story across, you know, and actually convincing donors and others that this kind of a broader outcome is also something. What's the reality of that?
Well, the reality is that we've had to say no to funding sometimes when, you know, I think we don't leave international staff on the ground in the community in any of the places where Little Ripples runs. And I think in the traditional, how we think of aid is that a group needs aid and then another group from outside goes in and helps. And so even in the cases where I can use a really specific example. So just like you said, we were very focused when, you know, Umda Tarbush, our camp coordinator, came to us and said, we need early learning. We said, okay. And really, we did create the original Little Ripples framework around child's outcomes and child development and early learning and play-based learning and, you know, these wonderful things for child outcomes. And then a year into it, when we came back and, you know, sat down and talked to the teachers, we had realized that the impact had been just as great on them. Was when we really started realizing, oh, our stakeholder and our central piece of this is not just the children, but it's also this group of women, they happen to be all women from 18 to 25 who were our teachers. And so they said to us, how can you help us be more confident in sharing this model and what play-based learning is and this approach with the rest of the community? And from there evolved something that we called Lead with Empathy, which is a peer-taught curriculum. It has a lot of different chapters and lessons involved in it. It was 8 lessons, now it's 30 in working with the refugee community. But when we got the funding for Lead with Empathy and to really solidify this opportunity for the teachers to gain confidence and look at themselves as their own leaders and identify their leadership strengths and how to engage their community in possibly livelihood projects. This was before the livelihood projects had gotten started. And our funder said, well, how are you going to know that it's working if you don't leave somebody on the ground? And we said, it's just not part of our model. Like we'll go for a little bit longer. Like usually our trips, especially to Eastern Chags, it takes about 5 days to get there from the States. You know, our trips were like 2.5 weeks. You know, we would train, check in, do a lot of listening, and then we would return and we would be on, well, what is now WhatsApp and Signal, which are amazing because those didn't exist when we started. And they were really quite, even though they were very human-centered designed, as a funder, they still were, it was challenging for them to think that we weren't going to leave somebody there who was just going to be like in charge of the success of the program, of this leadership and professional development training. And we just had to say, it's just not our model. And if you aren't comfortable with us not sending somebody and leaving them, then, you know, that's okay. And we'll look for funding elsewhere. In the end, they were like, okay, we're going to take a risk. We're going to trust in you. And it worked out. And at the end of our grant period, they came back and they were like, our minds are changed. So the challenge is that, but the challenge is practical challenges of communication. I think now that we have things like WhatsApp and Signal, it's a lot easier to have ongoing communication with our staff in all these different parts of the world. But I think we have created globally this narrative that communities who are on the move, communities who've been forcibly displaced, yes, they've experienced something quite horrific. Some may have trauma, some may have had the skills to move through that trauma already, but they are still capable and fully engaged and really want to help their communities. And that help should really be defined by them. And in this case, it was early learning, and then also the Refugees United Soccer Academy program. And then it was Lead with Empathy. And then we said, how can we help with livelihood solutions? And from there, we have other projects that have sort of stemmed off, all in support of the Darfur refugee community themselves. And I think at that center, what we have found is if we hold close to our actions, the idea that dignity is an essential need, then it changes the way in which we engage with the community themselves. I think selling that or marketing that is challenging because it's not short. It's not a short sentence, right? Like explaining what co-creating a curriculum is and explaining to people our approach, and that we really let the community themselves lead it and we are there to support them. And then I think also when we go into communities, we don't know the details of what Little Ripples is going to look like. You know, we have our teacher training model and we have our curriculum that have very key important pieces to it. It has small group play, large group play, outdoor play, indoor play. Everything is play-based. Washing hands, mindfulness is embedded always in the welcoming and the closing circle and in between. So we have these key pieces that are very informed by evidence. But in Greece, it runs in the afternoons. It's run by a much larger group of women. There's 4 different languages spoken. In Eastern Chad, it runs at 6 a.m. The salaries are different because the cost of living is different. It looks different than in Tanzania, which was more in child-friendly spaces with a partner. And so I think that the uncertainty of the finalized details also makes partner organizations and funders a little bit uneasy because of the uncertainty. And we want so much to hold the dignity and the hope and the power of the program with the community that we're okay going in with some of those details being uncertain and then finalized with the community. And in the end, the partners and donors have come back and been like, oh, it worked. But we are up against this idea that outsiders know better than the community themselves.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you both for the input. I think KTJ, you've come up with a slogan already. I think that kind of dignity as a central need is a wonderful concept there for grabbing that idea of why this underrepresented or this underappreciated stakeholder is so important. When we did the workshop, we observed we were working with 5 teams, and some, like iACT, immediately knew. When we talked about this concept, the answer was immediately obvious, and it was all about diving into the detail. Whereas other teams, actually, it was a bit of a, who is our underrepresented stakeholder? We're not sure. We haven't thought about it like that before. Let's think about that. And actually, we'd like everyone on the call now to do that exercise. What we're going to do is to break out into some breakout rooms in a moment. Jasmine's going to use the amazing power of Zoom. It's going to break us into smaller groups of about 5 or 6 people. If you haven't experienced this before, you don't have to do anything. You just have to wait a few seconds while the shift happens. And we'd like you to kind of try and self-organize in that group around going around the group 3 times. So first time, give everyone just 30 seconds to say hello, who you are, where you're from, what your organization is, but literally really quick. Everyone gets an opportunity to speak, and around you go so you know who's in the room. Second time, go around the room and answer the question about who's your socially undervalued stakeholder in your work. Who are they? What do they look like? What got you to that stage? And then that should be a fairly quick go around the room. And then third time, you can spend a bit more time about it. We'd like you to reflect a little more on that group and how you work with them. How is it you boost the status and the engagement of that socially undervalued stakeholder in your work? Perhaps it's obvious, perhaps it will be the first time you're thinking about it, but think out loud and answer that question. And if you've got time, why is that important for your strategy to scale, sustain, and increase impact? What difference does it actually make to your work and your strategy? So our experiences here, this leads to a really interesting description because the stakeholders will all be very different. But that's the task there. In the chat, we'll put a link to these slides. So if you haven't managed to grab those 3 questions, you'll just be able to open up the same document that we've just been looking at, and you'll be able to find those 3 questions. But three rounds in your room. We'll also send a little reminder of timing in. So you've got 45 minutes for this, just under, and we'll just send a reminder when you should be moving on to each of the next steps. So with that, Jasmine, over to you to do your Zoom magic, if you will. Great to see lots of smiling faces. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I certainly did. And that definitely brought new perspectives for me. We're going to keep the interactive element of this going, even though we're a much larger group. And we're going to do that by using the chat. There's an icon down at the bottom of your Zoom window that says chat on it, if you haven't discovered it already. And I want to challenge everyone in the group. What I'd like you to do is just reflect on the conversation you've had over the last 45 minutes. And I'd like you to type into the chat, what was the most significant or interesting idea that you discussed in the breakout room? When you're sort of going away from this and someone says, what were you doing today? And you need to sort of tell them in 20 seconds something interesting that came up, or an idea, a critical idea for you. What is it? Can you just type that into the chat? And what we should get is a stream that reflects the experience of 58 people rather than any one of us speaking for a moment. And then as we're doing that, I'd just like to invite anyone who would like to speak and to express a view or a comment, or maybe ask a question of others in the room. We've just got 7 minutes before we wrap up, but I'd love to hear from a few of the voices in the room about what you were just discussing and what came up. So you've got to multitask here. I need you to type something into the chat, and I'm interested in any thoughts, questions, or expressions from anyone who was in some of the discussion just now. Anyone like to kick us off with an observation? Or you can have an observation on the chat as well, if that provokes you.
I want to give a shout out to Maria Adelaida from AEIO2, which she brought a wonderful concept of the idea of using beauty as a way of bringing value to and respecting undervalued stakeholders. And Maria, do you want to just comment a little bit about that, how you thought about beauty as being central to your work?
Thank you, Nathaniel. Well, it is just the necessity of us to change the perspective or the understanding of beauty itself, in terms of seeing it as the right of cultivate and care for ourselves, for our well-being, and to respect and to listening actively to the other, and to be able together to create then spaces in which we can have balance, dignity, respect, equilibrium. So we can feel that all of us, no matter where you were born, have the right to live well and to take care and make things better. Thank you, Nathaniel.
I wonder,
else like to come in?
This is Rick Gordetsky. I wonder if Callie Tan, you can speak about the importance of dignity in both in terms of bringing the idea of expert to a different level, and what it's been like for you in that way and your program.
Yes, thank you. Our program is a program for early child disability that runs in Rwanda and Uganda primarily. And the program is facilitated by a combination of healthcare professional and expert parent. And our undervalued stakeholder is often the expert parent. And it is the thing that we have to sell hardest when we are selling the program to a new partner. And we, similar to the presentation given earlier, have to be quite clear that it is not a negotiable aspect of the program, and that the expert parent, who is themselves a parent of a child with disability, comes with equal expertise, different expertise, but equal expertise in a non-hierarchical way. And to have that, there needs to be dignity. And so I think we always find that new partners don't really understand this concept of the expert parent in an equal partnership, want to train separately, want to keep things apart between the healthcare professional and the expert parent. But once they've running the program, they really understand the lived experience of that expert parent and what they bring. And and they're always really overwhelmed by it and say, now we see what you meant, that it was not negotiable. And so it's that really, and we get braver as we get bigger. We get braver in being not negotiating. But I think we also have stronger stories. We have more powerful stories and bigger, places, better places as to advocate, and so I think it gets easier. But I think understanding and respecting the dignity of our expert parents, who themselves have often very difficult lived experiences of discrimination and exclusion, is absolutely core to what we do. And Christine was on the line, and she's a master trainer in our program in Uganda, and she also in our group talked very clearly about the power of our expert parents at all levels of our program.
Thank you, Kelly.
Kelly. You remind me, is Amy still on the line here? Because Amy, you were telling me just in the Little Ripples example of the challenges you have of paying your refugee teachers and the fact that donors don't like you paying them. And for you, you're saying that was fundamental back to the respect and so on that they deserve, includes being paid for the work. But
yeah, I'm still on the line. I think that's something KJ, kind of go back to what KJ says, just challenging around funders and being willing to also fund, the salaries of our colleagues in refugee communities, and their skills and the expertise and the knowledge that they bring to their roles. And Little Ripples couldn't, operate otherwise. So it's a challenge that we face sometimes. Is finding funders that are willing to fund refugee salaries directly. And helping, and which is also ultimately the needed for sustainability as well. And it's something that iACT really believes in terms of respecting and honoring the dignity of their work.
thank you. We've got a minute left, so Julian, you can possibly grab the last word here, actually.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. I just wanted to highlight a point that came up in our conversation. I was speaking with Andrew from Brick to Brick and Juan Camilo Portes, and they made the point that as our view of the ecosystem of stakeholders becomes more expansive, and we think more creatively about how to include undervalued stakeholders, the ecosystem then becomes larger and more complex, and the skills and diversity of skills needed to manage that ecosystem become more demanding. And so as we take this more expansive view, it's all the more important to think about the professional development of the people that we're empowering to manage that more complex ecosystem. I just thought that was a really powerful point. I wanted to highlight it.
Thank you. That echoes with parts of the discussion in the group I was in as well, where, as you say, sort of that power, that empowerment comes from the knowledge and the training and the support that's brought to the community. Thank you so much, everyone. We are almost out of time. Today we just decided to focus in on one concept from a workshop and a set of work that's much bigger and has got several other concepts. If the work we're doing on stakeholders and the idea of sort of a broader workshop that really maps that and dives into it interests you in your organization, then reach out. It will always be interesting to know if that's the case. And when we have workshop space coming up, we'd love to know of organizations who feel that would be of use to your work. Huge thank you to KTJ, to Amy, to Jasmine, all those who have just helped us put together the workshop today, and indeed supported the work more generally. Lots of you will need to sign off. Just have a browse through the chat, because there's some amazing examples coming up there. We'll also capture that and work out some way of putting that back into some of our work as well and feeding it around. But that's very reinforcing both of how important stakeholders are, but actually how much dignity and respect and bringing socially undervalued stakeholders really into the heart of our work actually makes an enormous difference to what we do. And that's the underpinning idea behind the whole concept that's been so interesting to explore with you. Thank you very much. And Penny, do you have a final word here in terms of our next workshop or topic on this?
Muted. I'd like to thank you all for putting this together and everybody for turning up and joining in. It's great to see so many faces and we hope to see many again. Jasmine will keep you in touch with our next workshop, which will be in early October. And we are going to continue this theme of engaging with the community and as we go forward in the next few workshops. So hope to see you all again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.